Hey everyone, it's Andrew here, co-founder of SX Network, with our February community update call. We got a ton of questions as well to get through, so should be a good presentation. And yeah, I mean, we're just going to stick to the usual format, just go through a couple slides, just updating everyone on what's going on, and then get to the questions. Next slide, please. So as always, I like to do a quick overview. SX Network is really three core interrelated platforms. There's SportX, which is the sort of consumer-facing web app. There's SX Protocol, which is the backend smart contract protocol that sort of facilitates everything. And then there's SX Blockchain. Next slide, please. So SportX is continuing to grow at a pretty rapid pace. We had our highest volume month ever in January. First time also hitting over $20 million. I think it was about 22.6 million, I believe. And looking at the last 12 months, we've been growing at an average of about 12.5% per month for 12 months, which is very, very strong. And with our last month, it sort of annualizes to about 275 million, which is around a $5 million annual revenue run rate for the treasury. Goal is to hit $500 million in 2022, which would be a little bit more than a 5x on 2021. And we continue to be the fastest growing prediction market, blockchain prediction market in the world. Next slide, please. So the community fund continues to grow as well. Nothing too crazy with this, as everyone knows. It's kind of cool looking at it though, because it started at zero just about exactly a year ago. We're at about 1.86 million now in assets in it. And that's actually net after all these different marketing expenses that it's obviously paid for. So that's pretty good. Let's keep it up. And obviously it's also got a ton of SX in it. I think last check it had about 76 million SX in it, which is about $40 million. And has another 400 million coming to it over the next 3 years. So we have quite the war chest to continue making SportX the largest blockchain-based prediction market in the world, which has been the goal from day one and continues to be the goal. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight a bunch of really awesome stuff that's been happening over the last, I guess, 2 months, because we didn't do our community call last month. The SX Network blockchain, because I know this is always everyone's first question. SX Network blockchain is now being audited with the estimated time of audit completion about end of February. That timeline, that's kind of our current timeline. Obviously, there's some fuzziness, but I do want to sort of reassure the community that things are moving along really nicely. We're definitely getting into kind of the final couple of innings when it comes to the development. And the Polygon SDK team, I guess it's now called Polygon Edge, has been huge in sort of getting us to this point, as well as our internal engineering team, especially with a shout out to Dan and Akshar, who have been really, Dan especially over the last 6 months has been spearheading this thing. So getting nice and close to launch. Also, we launched a very sleek new website for the sx.technology sort of landing page. And we've been driving traffic. I don't know if people have noticed, but our Discord's been growing quite a bit as well. Also just wanted to highlight SX got listed, SX Network token got listed on Bitfinex, which is kind of our second tier 1 exchange with 2 pairs. Next slide, please. So also SX got listed on IDEX and Impermax. IDEX is one of the most innovative, in our review, decentralized exchanges in the world. It's a hybrid AMM order book model, which is really, really cool. And SX was listed there, I believe, last week, which gives you more options to sort of yield farm, trade, and earn the IDEX token. Also in Permax, which we've been very bullish on for a long time, and we think the project is also one of the most innovative projects in the space. It allows you to sort of borrow and lend against your LP tokens. And so we're very pumped that SX is now part of Impermax. More of a, I guess, something, the second thing, I guess, is, which I've been kind of spearheading and I'm very, very sort of passionate about, which is the governance markets, also known as Futurarchy. So SX Network actually launched its first governance market over the past week, allowing bettors to actually decide governance and earn, essentially turning governance from a voting-based mechanism into a betting-based one. And we sort of put our first market out. Definitely recommend everyone to go check it out, because we are giving away $5,000 in bet credits to anyone, or sorry, to as a prize pool to bettors of that market. It's done actually reasonably well so far. I think it's around sort of $4,000 in betting volume, which is great considering sort of the complexity of governance markets. But I'm very, very bullish on governance markets long term. I think they have the potential to sort of solve the blockchain governance problem, which is increasingly going to be one of the biggest problems in the space, especially now that DAOs overall in the industry have about $12 billion in assets. And if you think the crypto market sort of economy is going to continue growing, it's pretty easy to see that figure going from 12 billion to 100 or 200 billion dollars of treasury assets. And the way I sort of think about it is the amount, the fees that should be available to people that can actually govern DAOs. If you think about it almost like a hedge fund model, and you take like a set percentage, maybe 1 or 2%, you're looking at like a multi-billion-dollar industry that is in charge of making decisions for DAOs, which you can think of as like kind of like a potential market size for governance markets, if that sort of makes sense. Anyways, very excited about that. So definitely check that out. It's the sushi swap proposal on the custom market on SportX. We put out an article which kind of explains it more, gives a good sort of example using the Ben Simmons, James Harden scenario, trade scenario, as a kind of a explaining what's going on. Finally, we actually just published this an hour ago, so we just fitted in time to get it in this presentation. But SX partnered with IDEX on a $1.6 million bet drop to all IDEX users, which is about over 32,000 wallet addresses. So if you've ever used IDEX, you've automatically received $50 in free bet credits. I think this is going to be great. Should be able to get a ton of new people into the SportX ecosystem. And as I was kind of mentioning in the Discord, we also have, this is obviously just tailored at getting IDEX community onto SportX. We're going to be rolling out a sort of, I don't know what exactly to call it. We'll call it the SportX stimulus check, which we'll be sort of announcing next week. We've just had too many things on the go this week to find time to announce it. But so we haven't forgot about, obviously, the core SportX users. Just want to let everyone know. Awesome. Okay, great. So next slide, please. So yeah, just quickly want to reiterate our 2022 roadmap. I mean, we've sort of talked about these goals a lot with everyone in the community. $100 million in SX Network TVL. I think that's very doable. That's obviously going to be, it's going to be something that's reliant on getting the chain out, having all these different applications that we're talking to. Many of them haven't actually announced yet. But very optimistic that we can get that. I think that's kind of the first step. Complementary applications. So we sort of broadened the mandate for SX Network slightly from just being focused purely on sports betting applications to sort of prediction markets, DeFi, and then even some NFT applications. And the reason why, there's kind of two reasons. The first is we've realized that one, there is actually quite a big need for a scaling solution for Polygon native apps. Gas fees on Polygon have essentially experienced one of the biggest kind of exponential increases I've ever seen, going from essentially zero to I mean, it's now costing kind of hundreds of dollars a week in gas costs. And we think Polygon's going to continue scaling. So I think that's going to become even more expensive, which is great for Polygon and sort of fits our thesis of why we chose Polygon in the first place. We think it's the dominant layer 2 scalability solution for Ethereum and kind of like the Polkadot of EVM chains. Anyway, so there's actually a lot of demand, we think, for sort of Polygon native scaling solution. And then finally, we also think that prediction markets don't exist in a vacuum. They sort of require complementary DeFi applications, NFT applications to really sort of thrive and hit their max potential. Okay, finally, third goal, $500 million in bets. So we set out to hit in our first community call $20 million a month. And it looks like we've obviously hit that goal. So now the goal for 2022 is $500 million, which would be about over a 5x increase from 2021. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we got a ton of questions, by the way. Thanks to everyone for answering all these questions. Putting out all these questions. So I'm going to try to rip through these relatively fast. We've got four slides of them, so you can kind of tell there's a lot of interest in finding out what's going on. So the first one, do you plan to enter the metaverse? So this is actually a great question, and it's something we've actually talked about quite a bit internally. So I don't know if anyone sort of knows Decentral Games. It's a sort of like metaverse casino, and it's done very well. And I think there's definitely something there in the metaverse. So I would just say it's not something that we don't have it on our internal roadmap or anything like that, but it's definitely something that is very intriguing. And you could imagine something like a virtual sports book, essentially. If anyone's been to a sports book in a casino, it's sort of not hard to see that being something that could be possible. Can SportX add live TV events in the future? Yeah, so that's definitely something we could do. Again, it's not on the roadmap in the short term, but we had a live stats toggle actually on SportX, but it didn't really get that much interest. But obviously streaming is a much better option. And so that's definitely something that we could do. About NFTs, is it possible to create and trade them in a marketplace with SX Network? Yes. So there's actually a project that's in stealth that we're pretty excited to announce at some point that is building this functionality for SX Network. Really, really excited to announce that when we can. We hope to have kind of a thriving NFT ecosystem on SX Network. How hard is it to get SX token listed in the most popular exchanges? I can't actually really answer this question. It takes a bit of time, but I mean, as you can see, obviously it's the market, like people are starting to fit. Oh, sorry, it's a bit loud there. People are starting to find out about SX token. We just listed on Bitfinex. So I think there's a lot of sort of positive trends there. Finally, for this page, I guess, is there any chance that SX token can be added in other networks as Phantom, BSC, Flow, Avalanche? Yeah, that's actually definitely possible. So any EVM chain we can bridge SX over relatively easily. The question is, where do you want to concentrate liquidity for the SX token? So right now that liquidity is concentrated on Polygon in sort of the Sushi Swap DEX, and a couple of other sort of DEXs on Polygon. And as you bridge it to these other networks, you sort of obviously you're fragmenting liquidity. The benefit though is you get to access sort of a new community to grow into. But from what we've seen, unless you actually deploy your application on the network, on that specific network, there's not that much demand for for the token. Like you want to list the token, bridge the token over to Phantom, for example, if we were to deploy SportX on Phantom, which is actually something we could do in the future, which may seem sort of counterintuitive to have both kind of a blockchain that's designed for SportX, but then also deploy SportX on multiple other chains. I think that's actually okay. The way we sort of think about it is blockchains, you can think of them almost as like sovereign digital economies, and then applications are sort of corporations. And so obviously the corporation can be sort of on its home market, which would be SX Network, but still be sort of multinational and exist on multiple different chains at the same time, with the idea being that it flows all the value back into its sort of home nation, using that analogy, which would be SX Network. So like actually I don't want to give too many details, but it's actually, there's actually a lot of interesting sort of strategies we can do using SportX as a sort of as a lever to grow SX Network by deploying on these other communities. Next slide, please. When we'll see SX partnership with Toronto Raptors. Yeah, crypto.com is the new name of this. It's a pretty bad name compared to Staples. Not that I don't mind crypto.com. Just I like the Staples Center a lot more. Yeah, sorry. So I think we'll see what happens there. I did see Terra just announced a big partnership with the Washington Nationals and the MLB. So I think it's definitely something that's interesting. A lot of crypto projects are obviously getting into the sort of the sports world. So yeah. Update on what's the biggest concern, threats to the project, competition, regulatory adoption. I think there's a saying, I think it's Paul Graham, which is like, competitors aren't really the big threat. It's usually adoption for startups. I think that's definitely true for us. I think one thing that's interesting is potentially a threat, but also potentially an opportunity, is that what we've seen over the last 6 months is a ton of projects that have sort of recognized the same thing we recognized 4 years ago, which is that there's going to be sort of a dominant blockchain-based sports betting platform and prediction market. And that's why we've seen a ton of sort of raises announced. And what's interesting about this to us is, like, one of the best things about SX Network is that these competitors could be potentially complementary to what we're doing. Because if we create sort of this, to me, the bigger threat is sort of, not even threat, but the bigger challenge is growing and taking market share away from traditional market players. And so, like, to me, I think all these different competitors are obviously in a lot of ways competitive, but in other ways they can kind of work together to go after the much bigger pie, which is the market share of sort of the global online betting industry. And so I think there's a lot of interesting things we can do to actually collaborate with other projects, especially because from what I've seen with a lot of these projects, they're taking a different sort of tact into the market, a different sort of technology approach. And so I think it's really interesting, this idea that you can actually have other sort of SportX platforms, in sort of other prediction market platforms in one network. Update on the market maker side, more market makers. Yeah, there's actually a couple new market makers coming online, which I'm really excited about. And so we expect to see even more depth on SportX relatively soon, with also tighter odds, I mean. And so I'm really excited about this. I think one of our key goals or key competitive advantages for SportX is getting to the point where we have the deepest markets in the world. And so I'm very excited about that. How did the team feel about doubling the rewards of the tournament and going with bet credits rather than cash? Yeah, I'm a huge fan of that. Bet credits are much better because they, like, the whole point with these rewards for tournaments is you want to essentially give them to traders on SportX or bettors on SportX. And so bet credits are sort of much more aligned with the success of the project because you essentially can only use them to actually trade on SportX. And so I think that's great. And because they're more aligned, you can sort of afford to give more of them. So it's just a much better and much more aligned sort of bonus program, I guess, whatever you want to call it. Debits and credits live on the blockchain forever, but what happens with customers' bet history? It's actually a good question. Whoops. Sorry, I'm just getting a bunch of these things. So the customer bet history, so it technically lives on the blockchain as well. So, that's essentially, you can go and check up your address on Polygon Scan, but you do have to sort of decipher it a bit to actually see what's going on under the hood. So, there's actually something very interesting there, though, which is because that exists and it's sort of like an open shared sort of data set, though you do have to decipher it, means that sort of other applications can build using that. And so I think there's something very interesting there that there's sort of a third-party team doing something that I think a lot of people in the SportX community are going to love. Next slide, please. AY, you mentioned SX Network within the blockchain of betting. What would be the advantage for a betting dApp to onboard their product to SX Network as opposed to another blockchain? And what incentives could SX Network offer to attract them? So I think that's an interesting question. The biggest thing actually is that most of these projects have no community or users yet. And so the obvious thing that you can offer to them is like a community of essentially the largest community of blockchain-based sports bettors. And then in terms of incentives, I mean, that's something that the Treasury, the community fund can sort of decide on. It's not really up to us to decide on that. What's great about this, though, is there's a Treasury with essentially 50% of the SX token supply. That is a huge war chest that the community can use to incentivize projects that we want to get on top of the network to come onto the network. So I mean, I think besides incentives, community, a lot of projects are also like building a blockchain-based sports betting application is very difficult. So a lot of applications are also just hooking into our infrastructure because it's much easier to jumpstart your project. And so, I mean, that's a huge sort of incentive for a bunch of projects as well that we've talked to. Aside of sharing liquidity, how does SportX benefit from PunchBet sharing the same network? Oh yeah, so PunchBet's hugely complementary to SportX and SX Network. PunchBet is essentially another front end that taps into the sort of shared liquidity layer of SX protocol and SportX. And so, I mean, it contributes sort of liquidity, obviously, but contributes taker demand, which is obviously more bets, which makes it even more attractive to be a market maker on the platform, creates more additional awareness. The front end is sort of tailored towards a different demographic, which is awesome because SportX is sort of more sophisticated, I would say. So there's a ton of other advantages from, I would say, besides sort of just shared liquidity, which by itself is actually a huge benefit. Any plan to go for mobile app for wider adoption? So we actually do have a PWA, so a progressive web app. Actually, I believe about 25% of our users actually use this. So if you have an iPhone, for example, and you go to sportx.bet on Safari, you can download, you can essentially, I think it's called like bookmarking, but it creates like essentially like a window, like similar to an app, which allows you to actually access SportX on mobile. That's only possible though with sort of the email wallet. We don't yet have integration with MetaMask mobile, just because it's sort of a newer thing, but it is something we've looked at as well. So yeah, I think in terms of like I guess an iOS app, that is definitely something we could explore if there's a lot of demand for that, for sure. But just to answer your question though, there is like a progressive mobile web app, and SportX is already mobile friendly. Which you'll notice if you ever just resize the window or go to SportX on a mobile phone. Of the various growth initiatives currently underway, what is the rough split of capital being allocated to each? I mean, it's sort of hard to say. I mean, I think what's interesting, I sort of agree with what the founder of DYDX was tweeting yesterday, which is that protocol teams aren't really properly set up to do marketing. They're more sort of set up for technology development. And I think the community fund sort of needs to step in a little bit on that side. With that being said, though, the one of the big things which we're obviously experimenting right now with the bet drop, the IDEX airdrop that was just announced, is this idea of bet drops. So essentially what that means is finding like-minded communities, particularly if they're on Polygon, and essentially giving away free bets to anyone that's used their platform, and then sort of co-marketing the sort of partnership with the sort of official Twitter threads of the, like, with the core team of the community. I think that's something that's very, very interesting, and also something we can spin up relatively fast now that we have this ability to do bet credits. And so I'm very excited about that. And just big shout out to the IDEX team for being the first ones to experiment this with. I also really like the idea of sponsored tournaments. We did one with QuickSwap, I think back in April last year. And I think that's something we could also look into doing. But yeah, I mean, just in terms of, I can't really give you a rough split. It's really, I would just say we're sort of trying a number of different approaches. How much hard dollars versus SX denominated payment investment? Don't totally understand this question. How much SX has been sold to strategics? So we actually have something pretty interesting with that. We're going to be announcing hopefully relatively soon. We sort of hinted at it in the Discord. If you go to the website, you'll notice we have sort of this investor section with some of the top crypto funds in the world and angel investors. So definitely take a look at that. It's obviously a huge vote of confidence from some of the top sort of crypto investors in the world. So we're very excited about that, but I guess more details there soon. Next slide, please. What benefits can the community expect to see from these partnerships? I guess that's related to the previous question. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty standard. Sort of VCs and all these different sort of institutional investors just have huge networks that they can help with, sort of on the business side in terms of getting new partners, attracting other investors, and particularly with sort of finding developers and other sort of application developers to launch their products on SX network, which is a huge benefit. And then obviously legitimacy with certain people within the crypto community. It's pretty standard things that sort of they provide. How do you view the competitive landscape given recent evolutions? Does it change, affect roadmap or strategy? Yes, it does. So we've actually, I think, almost tripled our development team over the last 2 months. So we're moving extremely fast, and we've significantly sort of accelerated a lot of things on our roadmap. And a big thing for us is sort of focusing on scalability at the moment, and then we have a pretty rich feature roadmap. I'll actually be releasing sort of a 2022 roadmap, so everyone can kind of get some more clarity on all these big things that are coming down the pipeline, and also just because I want to get everyone's feedback on what's going on, because it's obviously huge to get the community's feedback on these features. I mean, at the end of the day, you guys know it probably better than I do, and so that's definitely a big thing. But yeah, I guess just in terms of the competitive landscape, I think it justifies the fact that we sort of created this platform 3 years ago. Now that there's all these sort of other teams that are trying to get funding to get into this exact space as well. And then at the same time, I think it's a huge tailwind for SX Network. If our sort of thesis of a shared liquidity layer and sort of shared account setup for sports bettors and prediction market traders comes true. Like at the end of the day, to me, as like someone who uses crypto, ideally there's not a different sports betting platform on 50 different chains. Ideally, there's just one sort of chain where that's like the sports betting or betting chain. To me, that seems like a much more obvious sort of UX and better UX. Which is that's kind of like one thesis, and now we're very well positioned for that. At the same time, I understand that like some people are sort of diehard Avalanche users, diehard obviously Ethereum users, and so at the same time they do want to have sort of their own specific version, and so again it kind of I think of it as sort of like a macroeconomic theory in the sense that kind of like every country has their own banking system, but certain countries, their banking system is kind of like a global, like dominates the global market. And so I think of it in the same sort of way, where each of these chains is kind of like a sovereign digital economy, and they'll likely have their own native industry across all these different use cases. But then certain chains are going to likely dominate within specific niches and industries. We think about like the way we sort of think about the development, like the progression of smart contract blockchains is that wave one, Ethereum totally focused on security over everything and decentralization. And to me is clearly won that segment and is going to be kind of the global settlement layer and security layer. The next wave, which is where we are right now, is sort of scalable blockchains. So things like Polygon, Solana. I mean, there's so many different ones going on. And I think that those are focused purely on scalability and sort of winning a ton of market share there. And I think the third wave is going to be is both scalable, but then also sort of not exclusively focused, but sort of builds a niche or comparative advantage within specific sort of industries and specific use cases. And you're seeing that now with things like Ronin, which is sort of becoming like the play to earn chain with Axie Infinity. But at the same time has Katana, which is a DEX, because DEXs are sort of like fundamental building blocks of any chain, similar to like how like every country has a banking system. And you're seeing things like Osmosis, which is focused on decentralized exchanges. And then obviously SX Network with a focus on prediction markets. But at the same time, will have sort of its own DeFi and NFT ecosystems as well. Yeah, I mean, these last couple of questions, overall project funding. I mean, you can just look at the community treasury for that. Any plans to add WT? I mean, it's kind of a sort of random and specific question, but yes, definitely. One of the biggest things, and again, going back on how we've increased the engineering team significantly for the core team, is scaling up the website so that we can add a sort of become comparable to other websites in terms of lines and markets and things like that, as well as like other currencies. And so that's been something that we've been working on a lot, and I think it's going to sort of bear fruit with a big increase in markets over the next couple of months, which I'm super excited about. Once SX Network is launched, is there any thought or deploying on other layer twos, Starknet, ZK Zinc, once they become more stable over time? Yeah, so this actually goes back to my previous sort of thing, what I was talking about earlier, which is having SX Network doesn't actually preclude SportX from going on these other chains. Not to sort of like belabor this point, but like chains, you can think of chains as a sovereign digital, like essentially like its own economy or nation, and then applications are sort of similar to like a corporation. And so you want to focus on your sort of home nation or your domestic market first, and build up a huge competitive advantage there. And that's also where like the liquidity resides for your token and whatnot. But then over time expand onto these other chains if there's opportunities there. It wouldn't make sense to limit the growth of SportX by having it only focus on SX Network. With that being said, though, you can deploy on these other chains, and because you can think of SportX as like a state-owned enterprise in a way, because it's kind of owned by SX Network, which is its home chain. You can bring liquidity and users back to SX Network in pretty sort of unique and creative ways. And so I think there's actually you can sort of have both. You can have SX Network be the sort of the dominant hub of SportX, but then still have SportX on these other chains, which I'm super excited about. Awesome, guys. Well, that was that was a lot of questions, but I may have missed one or two. I was kind of running through those, but thanks again for everyone for well in the Discord later on. And yeah, thanks again, everyone, for the support. I got so many things coming down the pipeline, and everyone at the SportX core team is super pumped to continue sort of working on all this stuff, and especially now that sort of SX chain is getting closer and closer. We've got lots of exciting things coming down the pipeline, and yeah, thanks again.